Welcome back to the Nicola Center's Winter Conference. We belong to each other. My name is Diane Desierto. I teach human rights law here at the University of Notre Dame. This panel is titled, Who is My Neighbor? Racism and the Catholic Social Tradition. We have distinguished panelists today who will offer some opening comments, followed by conversation, and then questions from the audience. Now, as to the Q&A, participants can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time to submit a question to me. We will then collect your questions and pose them to the panelists at the end of the session. Permit me to introduce our panel, this distinguished panel, especially for this topic. Our first speaker, John Cavadini, is professor of theology and the director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. His research focuses on patristic and early medieval theology, the theology of Augustine, and the history of biblical and patristic exegesis. Professor Cavadini is the author of several theological books, including most recently Pope Francis and the Event of Encounter and Mary on the Eve of the Second Vatican Council, as well as a number of essays, articles, and reviews that have appeared in a wide range of scholarly and popular journals. In 2009, he was appointed by Pope Benedict XVI to a 5-year term on the International Theological Commission, and he has served as a consultant to the USCCB Committee on Doctrine since 2006. Professor Cavadini will speak first, followed by our second speaker, Professor Ernest Morrell, who is the Keough Professor in Literacy Education and the Director of the Center for Literacy Education at the University of Notre Dame. His scholarly interests include literacy studies, the teaching of English, critical media pedagogy, and post-colonial literatures of the African diaspora. Professor Morell is the author of 10 books and more than 90 articles, research briefs, and book chapters, including Stories from Inequity to Justice in Literacy Education, New Directions in Teaching English, and Critical Media Pedagogy, Teaching for Achievement in City Schools. Professor Morell is chair of the Planning and Advisory Committee for the African Diaspora Consortium and sits on the executive boards of LitWorld and the Education for Democracy Institute. So without further ado, let me turn to Professor Cavadini for his preliminary remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, Diane. And hi, everybody. It's nice to see you, even though I can't see you. But this little reflection that I'm going to offer comes from my attempt to find a kind of theoretical basis for anti-racist programming in Catholic institutions, instead of one that's drawn from Catholic tradition, instead of one that's drawn from Marxist analysis or from critical theory. And further, I was inspired by an interview that Gloria Purvis offered, inspired and convicted by it, but inspired to begin this way. Do Black lives matter? Do they matter as much as other lives? Is Black beautiful? Do we even see it? Any thoughtful person would hopefully answer these questions readily with yeses, yet the questions are also often unsettling because they force us to think about the possible ways of answering no, ways that might reside within our own hearts. Often these no's are unseen or unacknowledged, and therefore all the more troubling and all the more troublesome. Is there a theological paradigm that would allow us to put both yeses and no's into perspective and to chart a way forward? The answer to that question, at least, has to be yes. And the concept of the preferential option for the poor surely has a foremost claim on our attention in this matter, drawn from Catholic social teaching. So what is the preferential option for the poor? Pope Francis characterizes it this way: God's heart has a special place for the poor, so much so that he himself became poor. The allusion to 2 Corinthians 8:9, and that's from Evangelii Gaudium. Pope Francis goes on to point out, here's a long quote, ready? For the Church, the option for the poor is primarily a theological category, rather than a cultural, sociological, political, or philosophical one. God shows the poor his first mercy This divine preference has consequences for the faith life of all Christians, since we're called to have this mind which was in Jesus Christ. Inspired by this, the Church has made an option for the poor, which is understood as a special form of primacy in the exercise of Christian charity, to which the whole tradition of the Church bears witness. This option, as Benedict XVI has taught, is implicit in our Christian faith in a God who became poor for us so as to enrich us with his poverty, end quote, and another allusion to 2 Corinthians. So the preferential option for the poor is a category derived from revelation, not, in the first instance, a category of unaided scientific reason. It's not a doctrine that can come from the secular disciplines, not even philosophy. We can go on to observe that the poor are not only those who suffer financial hardship, though this is most often a primary characteristic, but the category is wider. Here's what Professor Gustavo Gutierrez, the John Cardinal O'Hara Chair in Catholic Theology, Emeritus, here at Notre Dame, has to say about it. Quote, "What does being poor mean? I believe that a good definition does not exist, but we can approximate it if we say that the poor are the non-persons, the insignificant ones, the ones that don't count either for the rest of society or far too frequently for the church, for the Christian churches. For example, the poor are the ones who have to wait for a week at the door of the hospital to see the doctor. The poor are the ones who have no social or economic relevance, the ones disowned by means of unfair laws. The poor are the ones who have no possibility to speak, to change their predicament. The poor are the ones who constitute a despised and culturally marginalized race. At best, the poor are present in statistics, but they do not appear in society with proper names. We do not know the names of the poor. They are and remain anonymous," end quote. In other words, the poor are those whose lives do not matter, or do not matter much. They are neither beautiful nor not beautiful, but mostly faceless, relatively invisible because they are forgettable. Perhaps a photo in a solicitation for a charitable cause catches the imagination for a few seconds, but mostly one does not stop to ponder the beauty of that which is already forgotten. The poor are those on the mental back burner. One gets to them or not. The relevance to the question of racism is obvious. It is true that not only Black lives, but all lives matter. But to respond to the question, do Black lives matter, by immediately saying all lives matter, is from the perspective of the preferential option for the poor to say something true in a way that tends to subvert that very truth. It is to forget that in reality, some lives do not seem anyway to matter, or not matter much, as much. The preferential option for the poor requires us to stop and notice that. The poor are more likely to die an early and unjust death, not because no one cares, but because no one cares enough to see that it does not happen, or because not enough people care enough. The preferential option for the poor asks us first to notice the way in which some lives do not, in fact, but only in theory, matter. It means then that for us to answer the question, do Black lives matter, with an honest yes, and not just a theoretical all lives matter, is to try to do something about what we have noticed. Namely that in fact, in society, Black lives are not preferred and do not matter as much. We can't answer the question with an honest yes unless we exercise the preferential option for the poor and start by preferring those lives that have not in fact mattered much. Does that mean we forget about all the other lives that matter? Of course not. But the thing is, it's already obvious to us that those other lives matter. We have to start by preferring the ones that do not so obviously matter, at least not as much as those other lives. But even more profoundly then, friends, and think about it, we can see that the preferential option for the poor is, in a way, simply the preferential option for human dignity. God's heart has a special place for the poor, so much so that he himself became poor. God makes it clear that he does not prefer what we in our fallen state of original sin prefer, namely power, prestige, status, and the markers of status, which are completely conventional and arbitrary. The poor are us, without the status markers that we use to mark our preferences, without the money that we use to guide our hearts, without the power that we are always deferring to or admiring or envying. The preferential option for the poor is quite simply the preferential option for human being as such, in his or her innate vulnerability, and for the dignity attaching to humanity intrinsically. In our fallen state, we do not prefer the human being intrinsically, but we rather prefer supplements and add-ons that seem to make human being as such more worthwhile, more useful, more important. This means that in preferring the poor, we are leaving these other preferences behind, often at a cost, and learning to prefer human being as such. From this perspective, if we do not stop preferentially to say Black lives matter, but simply reply all lives matter, we are risking giving preference to the status and power that easily attracts and keeps our attention and our preference. And that in turn is to risk saying no lives matter. Because if power and its prestige markers are what actually matters to us, are what deep down we actually prefer, then human being as such, human dignity, does not matter. This is the cynicism and nihilism hidden within racism. Is there a part of us that to the question, do Black lives matter, would have to answer yes, but only in theory? Are there ways in which we act or in which the church acts that seems to answer without words, yes, but only in theory? Is Black beautiful to us? Or is whiteness the norm for beauty? Not usually because we have thought much about it and have made a conscious judgment, but because we don't think much about it. We don't think much about Black, whether it is beautiful or not. Do we even act, even without realizing it, as though in order to be beautiful, it must be on white terms? As though in order to rise to visibility, it has to be within white circles and on white conditions, in some ways whitened. Another way of putting the question, does the church in Africa matter to us as much as the church in Europe or in the US? Do we see the church in Africa, which is almost 100% Black? Do we see it as the church, or only the backyard, as it were, of the real church? God's heart has a special place for the poor, so much so that he himself became poor. We know then that in exercising the preferential option for the poor, even when this means some difficult and penetrating self-examination, means coming to know ever more deeply and ever more fully the cost of the incarnation, of the self-emptying of the one who was in the form of God in order to take on the form of a slave. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes, Paul says, he became poor, that through his poverty you might be rich. To prefer, and in exercising that preference to come to know the poor, in whatever form that poverty takes, is to come to know more deeply the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. It is to be formed in contemplation of the gratuitous love which undertook this impoverishment of the incarnation for our enrichment. No matter how much it may sting to discover our complicity in contempt or scorn or erasure, we are in that same discovery also discovering how much we are loved and how much we have been enriched with the riches of God's heart. These riches are so much more beautiful than the riches we have preferred in our love for status, for privilege, for prestige, and for money. In short, in our love for power. Instead of finding what we had feared in our self-examination, namely that we are not loved and cannot be loved, we find the opposite. We are loved in the very poverty to which our self-examination reduces us. And we discover in that love a bond of communion to all other human beings. In fact, the only bond of true communion that exists or can exist, the completely self-giving love of God revealed in the precious blood of Christ that has no ulterior motive or agenda or self-interest. Ultimately, then, the preferential option for the poor, though it has a deconstructive moment, is a constructive preference, constructive of human community. It does not leave people in a potential position of permanent division or yield to an us against them mentality as the ultimate reality. As the US bishops once wrote, quote, "As followers of Christ, we are challenged to make a fundamental option for the poor, to speak for the voiceless, to defend the defenseless, to assess lifestyles, policies, and social institutions in terms of their impact on the poor. This option for the poor does not mean pitting one group against another, but rather strengthening the whole community by assisting those who are the most vulnerable." Pope Paul VI, and especially John Paul II, and echoing them, Pope Francis, calls this the project of building of civilization of love, a constructive project. And that's where I'd like to end, friends. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cavadini, for those excellent preliminary remarks. We now turn to Professor Morell for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, John. And I'd like to offer a special thanks to the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture for hosting this panel. I'd like to begin my brief comments with a focus on the theme of solidarity. When speaking on this theme, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops remind us that we are one human family, whatever our national, racial, ethnic, economic, and ideological differences. We are brothers and sisters, keepers wherever they may be. Loving our neighbor has global dimensions in a shrinking world. At the core of the virtue of solidarity is the pursuit of justice and peace. In the January 1st, 1972 message for the celebration of the Day of Peace, Pope Paul VI challenged that if you want peace, you must be involved in work for justice. In the Gospel of Matthew, Christ invites us to become peacemakers and to practice mercy. Manifesting a Christian love for all members of the human family demands that we promote peace in the world surrounded by violence and conflict that are often inspired by racial prejudice and perceived racial divisions, even, as John mentioned, racial hierarchies. The USCCB further challenges us to move through an understanding of interdependence to a commitment to human solidarity. That challenge must find its realization in the kind of community we build among us. Love implies concern for all and a continued search for those social and economic structures that permit everyone to share in a community that is part of a redeemed creation. When referring to the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul writes that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. A contemporary reading of Paul's words through the lens of solidarity demands a movement beyond the current discourse of division that permeates the media and our contemporary political paradigm. We must develop what I have called elsewhere a critical Catholic media literacy, one that reads against all media through the lens of the Catholic social tradition. To do that, we must move from an objectification of groups of people based on social constructions and negative hierarchies to an insistence on a Catholic subjectivity. It isn't, of course, that all individuals are Catholic, just that we commit to seeing them as God does, as made in his image and worthy of love. We must insist that we can be different without being divided. The body of Christ is a perfect foundation for our anti-racism project. But we must also acknowledge that silence in the face of injustice is acquiescence to that injustice. In considering the second theme I'd like to speak to briefly, call to family, community, and participation, we're also reminded by the USCCB that the person is not only sacred, but also social. How do we organize our society in economics and politics, in law and policy, directly affects human dignity and the capacity of individuals to grow in community. Marriage and the family are the central social institutions that must be supported and strengthened and not undermined. The USCCB further advocates that people have a right and a duty to participate in society, seeking together the common good and the well-being of all. Two principles that are germane to our discussion here. One, how does structural racism assault the Black family? And two, how do we as Catholics participate in communities that transcend racial divides? Again, speaking to the body of Christ in Romans 12, Paul writes that in Christ, we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis reminds us that local individuals and groups can make a difference. They're able to instill a greater sense of responsibility, a strong sense of community, and a readiness to protect others. Social problems must be addressed by community networks and not simply by the sum of individual deeds. As we consider how we might further engage the themes of solidarity and call to family, community, and participation in the work of anti-racism, I would like to offer a few thoughts and questions. The first, how do we better leverage our networks to work against racism, and more specifically, the divisions that are exacerbated by our perceived racial divisions, which are also, as I mentioned earlier, perceived racial hierarchies? What are the ways that the sin of racism manifests itself in our local communities and institutions? And how have Catholics engaged powerfully in anti-racism work? I'd like to spend some time considering Catholic education as an example of how we might ask all of these questions. Some of the first schools, including the very first school to integrate and to educate students of color in the United States, were Catholic schools, that being the Ursuline Academy in New Orleans in 1727. The NCEA reports that 99% of Catholic high school students graduate, with 86% of those students immediately attending a four-year college. 20% of the students enrolled in U.S. Catholic high schools are students of color who also have the same very high demanding standards applied to them and the same patterns of achievement for at least two generations. Dating back to the early 1990s, we have published studies showing African American students taking harder math and science courses in Catholic schools than the national average. And that, again, has continued for the past 30 years. As the single largest non-governmental provider of education, the Catholic Church saw over 53 million students pass through the doors of its nearly 150,000 K-12 schools in 2015. Since 1970, the number of students attending Catholic schools globally has nearly doubled. According to the 2017 Pontifical Yearbook, recent trends indicate that most of the accelerating growth of the Catholic school population is occurring in Africa, South Asia, and in Latin America. We're also lucky here at the University of Notre Dame to have very smart domestic and international Catholic education policy work conducted by scholars like Nicole Garnett, a colleague of Diane's in the Notre Dame Law School, who has published several articles and books on this subject, including Lost Classroom, Lost Community, Catholic Schools' Importance in Urban America, and the Comparative Legal Landscape of Educational Pluralism. Professor Garnett has also advised the USCCB on issues of Catholic educational policy that increase the likelihood of maintaining vibrant, diverse, and successful Catholic schools. The Keough Institute for International Studies, directed by Paulo Corazza, has sponsored a research cluster on global Catholic education that has convened scholars, educators, and clergy from every continent. I am also happy to be a member of a cross-disciplinary research team that is exploring the historical impact of Catholic schools on social mobility in the African diaspora. But we have a long way to go. How can we make our curricula, our pedagogical approaches, and the school leadership philosophies at these Catholic schools more culturally responsive and anti-racist? How can we ensure that our teaching force and school leaders more adequately reflect the ethnic representation of children and families? How can we work to ensure that Catholic colleges and universities are recruiting and retaining the graduates of our Catholic K-12 schools? And how can we do the historical work of acknowledging when and where we have not gotten this right. The Catholic social themes of solidarity and call to family, community, and participation underscore our oneness, our unity, the inherent dignity of all human beings, and our call to love one another as Christ loves us. More importantly, for today's conversation, we're called to see others as we see our own family members. We're called to be responsible for one another, to participate meaningfully in the lives of one another, to advocate for one another, and to leverage our networks in the church to work more feverishly for social and racial justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernest, for those wonderful remarks and very, very insightful and informative. Thank you as well, John. I know we have a number of questions. I will exercise the moderator's prerogative to start with mine. Both of you really touched on the core theme of where present responses appear to focus on division and how that is not consistent with Catholic social teaching, particularly when it comes to anti-racism. What would you say to those who have some degree of deep impatience already with the church's consistent teaching of the call to conversion of the human heart? I mean, it's not like the Catholic Church has not embodied and represented anti-racist behavior. It's been there, and teachings, the magisterium has been consistent since the 1500s in squarely rejecting forms of racism and recognizing Indian nations among others. So much as it's been, and it's also in its own document on the Church Against Racism, also recognized that throughout its history, there have been instances of complicity by certain members of the church, but it has been willing to confront that in the spirit of love of one's neighbor, as both you and John have spoken of. But in today's climate, where there's popular impatience, how do we appeal to those who think that the call to conversion or the call to education or even a call for a preferential option for the poor is not enough? How do we center the discussion back to that unity? And so let me turn the question to either of you who would like to respond. John, yes?
I was actually gesturing to Ernest. I wasn't raising my hand.
Ernest?
Sure, I was looking forward to John's response, but I think that there are a couple of important points that you make, Diane. You know, in preparing for the talk, I was thinking this morning of kind of the liminal space that Catholics have to walk within. You know, and that's why I brought up this notion of a discourse or a common conversation that always seems to have a sense of urgency and preeminence. While that conversation may change over the centuries or the generations, its preeminence doesn't. The Catholic space is a liminal one. We operate in a different time horizon. As John was talking about, we operate on different principles, theological principles, as opposed to kind of the principles of economics or law that may guide the world. So our pathway is going to seem at times too patient, too soft, too unexacting in its revenge. But we're also called to center ourselves in a discourse of love. Yeah. That being the case, I do think that where we can move forward, and I think particularly in the words of Pope Francis and the USCCB, is in thinking about how we leverage our institutions and our networks actively in the anti-racist work, which is why I ended with a case study of education. We could think about healthcare, we could think about parish life, we could think about higher education. And those are places, particularly those of us who are centered in that world, can think very actively about what we do together. And I think the distinction in Laudato Si that Pope Francis makes between the sum of individual acts, as opposed to kind of leveraging our Catholic faith, the 1+ billion of us, I do think we are we are challenged to think more proactively there. What does that mean in higher education? What do we do at Notre Dame and the other institutions that are represented here at the conference? We can be very active in that agenda. I think John's work is an excellent theological foundation. And then I think some of the work of the solidarity and the call to family, communities, and participation is how we enact that. And I definitely think that should be the question. What is it that we do in this moment? How are we called to embrace what are really the timeless principles of our faith, but how do we respond to this moment, leveraging the institutions and the networks that we have at our disposal, which are considerable?
Thank you so much, Ernest. John, before I turn to the other questions now.
Yeah, what Ernest said, certainly. I'd also, I guess, impatience is, I guess, something we all feel. I wonder, I think that what we find in Pope Francis and other magisterial documents, though, is that, the cultures don't change unless hearts change. So you can change laws, and that has an ameliorating effect, but it doesn't change a culture unless you change some hearts, unless you change hearts. And so the issue of conversion is very pertinent, and it's also it's also slow. Hearts don't change that quickly because it often involves, self-examination that's not as pleasant as you might want it to be. You find out things about yourself that you maybe wish you hadn't found out, maybe. I don't know. But I think impatience leads to utopian thinking. And utopian thinking inevitably leads to the creation of another class of people who are disposable. Utopian thinking, Marxist thinking, et cetera, ends up, because it's a systemic response only, it ends up creating another class of marginalized and poor, and sometimes destroying them. So I think what we're looking for is kind of the ability to think about creating a culture, what Peter Morin used to say, where it's easier to be good. Not a utopia, but a society in which it's easier to be good. And in such a society, I think personal witness matters a lot. I think that if we're always thinking about the only recourse is massive systemic change, then that also feels like I can't do anything, or my personal witness doesn't matter. But culture is actually built up through the personal witness of individual people. Sister Thea Bowman, by the way, is a great example of that. In a sense, it's this personal witness that begins to create culture. And so I think that the impatience that arises from the desire for systemic change that can only come from creating a new system, which is a kind of massive sort of effort, often means that a culture doesn't change. It moves from one system to another, instead of creating a culture where hearts are more likely to be converted, and instead of empowering people to feel like they can do something, instead of like their life is futile and my witness means nothing. So I guess that's what I'd say.
Ernest, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask John a question, because I really respect that answer. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of theological wisdom for us to, like, accountability doesn't seem like the right word, but that we can keep the temperature on the church and on ourselves without falling into that impatience. How do we know where we're headed and how we're doing in a way that doesn't kind of capitulate to the contemporary discourses, but doesn't kind of kick the can indefinitely down the road?
Yeah, I guess I'd say that, look at the example of Dorothy Day, direct personal action. If you're not engaged in any, you're probably kicking the can down the road. The preferential option for the poor means somehow engaging in anti-racist gestures and anti-racist, in this context anyway, anti-racist gestures and actions, those can be in the domain of the corporal works of mercy or in the domain of the spiritual works of mercy. In education, like you're suggesting so ably and inspiringly. So I think there's not an external authority in some ways that's gonna put pressure on you. You have to develop the Christian life, which is one of continuing conversion, and then you have to bear fruits worthy of that conversion. But you also, I think it's an ongoing thing. I think sometimes in the desire for perfection, even personally, you just stop trying to achieve anything. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, Ernest, how to find I guess you could say that it's part of the job of the educator to keep the fire on. It's part of the job of the pastor also. I mean, someone who preaches from the scriptures. You yourself were showing, I thought, so beautifully how these ideas of solidarity and interdependence, which have secular cognates, but you were showing how they come from a Christological basis, the body of Christ. If one part suffers, all suffer, so that you've got the basis then for pastoral exhortation in homiletics and for Christian education in Christian schools, Catholic schools, etc. So I guess those would be two locations where people can kind of, I forget the nice way you put it, but keep people's feet to the fire, our own feet to the fire.
Yeah, to take our temperatures.
Yeah.
Well, let me turn to there's a long queue of questions and quite a number of those who are in the audience very interested in posing these questions. Let me start with Elizabeth Self, who is a Soren Fellow at the Nicola Center. And she asks, how do we take up the part of the racially marginalized while holding reservations about the language of wokeness? How does a preferential option for the poor compare to the woke hierarchy of persons? And John, I think we could start with you, since she did refer to the preferential option for the poor, and how would it compare to a woke hierarchy of persons?
Okay, thanks for the question, Elizabeth. I guess partly I lost the first part of my thought. What was that? Say it again, the question, sorry.
So the question is, how do we take up the part of the racially marginalized while holding some reservations about the language of wokeness?
Okay. Yeah, so, okay, two things I would say. I love the Gloria Purvis article in Church Life Journal that I referred to, because she takes up this question partly. She takes up the question, doesn't the organization Black Lives Matter have a kind of Marxist or anti-Catholic theoretical foundation? And she said it may, but that doesn't actually make the question, does Black Lives Matter, irrelevant and one that we shouldn't ask. And I thought that was well taken, because you can use the fact that the phrase Black Lives Matter, or even Black is Beautiful, originated in political context where some of the theory is Marxist or is anti-Christian. That doesn't mean the questions don't matter, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to find a different way of thematizing or theorizing the question that disconnects it from those more objectionable theoretizations. And I think the preferential option for the poor provides a way of doing it that also doesn't give you an easy out. In other words, it doesn't say, well, there's no politics involved at all. It doesn't. It directs you to the way in which your own sympathies might be formatted by a politics that actually are racist without you even knowing it. And And I take I like the question about wokeness also, because the woke paradigm, or the one that comes from white fragility, et cetera, I've heard retreats based on white, and it kind of leaves you in a position where it's almost like any action you take, I feel anyway, is futile. Like we're in a position where we're at loggerheads, we're never not going to be, and repentance doesn't actually get you anywhere. But on the other hand, conversion is a waking up in some way, right? I was blind, but now I see. And so I think there's an analog that the idea of the preferential, often for the poor, preserves, because there's a way in which coming to find out one's own, one's own complicity, in a sense, is a wake up, is a kind of waking up, but also it gives you the ability to do it at the same time as you wake up to the grace of Jesus Christ, who became poor for us. And I think that's a different kind of awakening, or it takes the other one into itself and brings it into a domain where I think conversion goes somewhere. Conversion builds community instead of being deadlocked in division. So I think I like both the way the sort of secular paradigms there's a cognate to them, but also in which they're taken up into the framework of revelation and then given a new horizon.
Thank you for that. That's extremely beautiful, John. Ernest, there's a question directed specifically to you from Rachel. What cultural responses would you recommend to current Catholic school faculty and teachers in the United States? And this is a pressing question, absolutely, especially under the present circumstances.
Yeah, I'd love to respond. And then subsequent to that, can I just piggyback on the response to the first question? Rachel, thank you for the question. I was thinking of a lot of ways to go with this, but I think first and foremost for me is a term I've been playing around with in my mind. It's reimagining and re-imaging African Catholic diasporas. And I think that this is the work. It kind of deals with Elizabeth's question as well, because I think part of the success of the woke paradigm is the silence of the Catholic one. And what we need to do is help kids to reimagine the Catholic trajectory in the Catholic community with the presence of the diaspora. I'm sitting here, like at my table, I'm looking at a statue of St. Martin de Porres. It's on our table. Most kids don't know who that is, or the work that he did. So I think we need a project. It's kind of like people might not like this terminology, but the radical Catholic tradition of love and solidarity. It's out there, right? We don't have great resources for it. So when we talk about people who are actionable in the world, we go outside of our faith tradition. We need to do a much better job of this. I don't know that the curriculum has already been written. The other thing I think we really need to do is allow kids to talk about their syncretic cultural Catholicisms, their life outside of the school and the church with a powerful voice that isn't apologizing for the language their parents speak or the neighborhood they come from, that we're explicitly critical of the paradigms of hierarchies that John talked about so eloquently. You can tell a kid they're loved, or you can make her feel like a genius who is loved by her family and those around her who are also geniuses, and that's superior. So there are two parts of this. Part of it is a representation of the diaspora Catholicism that is powerfully among us. And second is a space for voice. To articulate one's own humanity is the truest gift, I think, of what I would consider a pedagogy of love.
Thank you for that, Ernest. In fact, if I can add on, what you're saying is exactly why the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination at the UN congratulated the Catholic Church for the uniqueness of Catholic schools and Catholic education that can foster this kind of unity amid differences, which sort of turns me to the next question here from Soren Fellow Ali Moritzen. She's a junior who's majoring in chemical engineering. So the question is, How do the many parts of the one body of the church recognize their common purpose and shared dignity without diminishing true differences, whether they be in appearance, in culture, in history, or in role in God's plan? Any takers? John?
I'll just give a quick theological answer, which is probably useless. I'm good at useless things. But I guess you could say it's always the perfecting work of God to make us more ourselves. And thereby, in Revelation, it says that our own unique name will be revealed, at the end of time. And that's a way of saying how the work of God's grace in us, the work of God's grace perfecting us, makes us more ourselves, not less ourselves. The work of totalitarianism tries to strip people of individuality and to make them less themselves and more just part of a class or part of a, die casts of humanity. But that's never the work of God. The work of God is always to build communion by perfecting the love, by configuring each person to the perfect self-giving love of Christ. But that actually makes you more yourself. It makes you freer, and it makes your own distinctive gifts come out more robustly and more manifestly. And so you can think of the communion of saints in this regard, how the communion of saints are also different from each other. It didn't homogenize them by configuring them to Christ's love, but it made them all more themselves in communion. So there's the theological answer anyway.
Ernest, thank you, John.
It's always a pleasure and a challenge to follow John. I was thinking about extending the metaphor because I really do think that difference and diversity are very different ways of looking at this. I prefer difference. It's not that I'm opposed to diversity. When you think about the body, take an elbow and a knee. It's not a question of a hierarchy. They serve different purposes. There are times when an elbow is more important and a time when a knee is more important. So in the functions of the body, the natural working of the body honors those differences without there having to be a contrived space for that. The challenge for us, Diane, and it was Allie?
Allie,
the challenge for us is to redefine the work so that the differences become necessary. And I think that John alluded to this, and do we think of the Church of Africa as the backyard or the central work of the church? When you think about the work that we need to do to make Christ known, loved, and served in the contemporary world, all of our differences become immediately necessary. The languages we speak, the cultures that we adhere to, the regions from which we kind of project logistically, we have to reconceptualize the work and who the workers are. I think that's our task right now, how we leverage our networks. I think that there's really good language coming out of the USCCB and coming out of the encyclicals and the work we have from the Vatican. When we do that, I think that the necessity of our differences becomes not a liability, but a core necessity of the work of being a Catholic today.
If I could ask a follow-up question, Ernest, because as you did rightly point out, the teachings have been there, whether they are from the magisterium, from the encyclicals, from the practice of the church in the 1500s. So why, in the present climate, do we feel, or at least we sense, that there is sort of a vacuum when it comes to what does Catholic social tradition have to offer on this very fraught question of anti-racism? I mean, why has the secular culture dominated our responses or even the frameworks within which we engage the sin of racism and the question of racism? And why has there been the silence that you alluded to earlier?
I have two quick responses. One, I think, is just tragic but understandable. The other may be more sinister. I think that the tragedy is our inability to find ways to engage the popular discourse through the tools of that discourse without its ideologies. I was inspired, as I told the Soren Fellows in the Bread of Life dinner a couple of years ago, by St. John Paul II and this notion of evangelizing the culture. So we have to use the tools, but for different purposes. So sometimes I think the silence is just, we don't operate in those spaces. It's not that we can't, we just don't. And that's, I think, the easy fix. And I think that the more savvy we become with articulating who the church is and what we do and not being articulated, you say Catholic Church, people are going to talk about the crisis and sex abuse and McCarrick, but they don't know the work that we're doing. They don't know Catholic Relief Services. They don't know this narrative about the schools. And so we just have to do a better job of that. The second that is more sinister is, I think, a comfortability in a racial paradigm. The Bible does not speak to race. Race is a social construction. It is a relatively recent social construction. It does not exist, but there's a comfortability in saying we norm a certain kind of racial paradigm that infantilizes others. Mm-hmm. And so we can't engage the people that we've infantilized in our own ideology, our own moment. And that's something we have to deal with. I tell my students, with all due respect, those were Catholic slave ships that were coming into Africa in the 16th century. So that's a part of the beginning of this, and we can walk away from that. We should walk away from that. I am really inspired by the younger generation, who I really do think can preserve the notion of culture and difference, but get past the insidiousness of the false pseudo-biological conceptualizations of race. They both need to happen. One's a little bit easier than the other, but I think both can explain the relative silences.
So we have more questions coming up, thanks to both of you. Deirdre asks, how would you both define the sin of racism? How is it corporate or institutional? How is it individual or personal? And how would those interact? John?
Okay, it's actually hard to follow Ernest, so I think maybe he should take it up. But a definition. I guess a definition might be that, well, one way of thinking about it, I suppose, is if whiteness, which is also a cultural construct, like Ernest was saying, but still, if that construct, whiteness, defines your reality, and everything else is measured by that. So that when you think of the church, for example, you think of the white church, and then you don't really think of the church in Africa. Was an example I tried to give, and I've been to Africa 3 times now, and every single time I realized how much I had done that. Like, I hadn't thought about the church in Africa, but when you go there, it's much more vibrant than our own church in some ways in the United States. And you could say it's the church in a sense par excellence, but to think, so this kind of way it seizes your imagination, and it can seize the imagination, like using whiteness as a paradigm. You don't notice it until something wakes you up, but then you may notice the way in which institutions you're associated with also do that. And so the two things are connected, because the institution teaches something or passes something on or encodes something, if you want to put it that way. And we don't notice it until something wakes us up. I think that Catholic social teaching is one thing that can wake us up. And Preferential Often for the Poor asks us precisely to try to see people we don't normally see, because we have a lens that defines importance, and they don't fall under that category. It's not that we necessarily think this consciously, but we don't see it. That's why we talk about, I was blind, but now I see, I think. So I don't know if that's a very good answer, but using whiteness as the paradigm for valuing and status means that we prefer that, and we don't see the other. And in fact, we step on the other, and we ignore the other, and we erase the other. And once you wake up to that, I think there's the whole Catholic tradition of repentance and of conversion, and it's not instant. So I don't know, maybe that's how I'd put it.
Thank you, John. And Ernest, before I turn to your answer, I wanted to also interject another question following up of what you said earlier. One of the members of the audience reflected or asked to reflect on the impact of colonialism on the moral standing of the Catholic Church on matters of racism in Africa and other areas of the world that have been colonized. So focusing on Deirdre's original question on the sin of racism, how could the church confront its own sins in this respect?
Yeah, I think that they're really connected. I'll try to kind of tease them apart for a second, because as John was talking, I was thinking about two different kind of layers of the sin. One is of imagination, and the other is what that imagination allows to happen, the action, so to speak. In thinking about the first, I was musing this morning with my family as I was thinking about the talk, and I can honestly say, I have never leaned back in a church and looked at the murals on the ceiling and seen a black body in heaven. I mean, not one.
Yeah.
So that's an imagination right there. I mean, heaven is exclusively segregated. I would assume that is the case in the basilica as well.
Yes.
So the imagination is that that's normal. By the same token, you'd have no problem if a news episode said we were at Rikers Island or San Quentin or prison and everybody that was in that prison was black. These are norms. In every city, there's a block that you traverse, and all the people change. Depending on the direction you're going, they're more affluent or there's more material pressure. So we imagine that as normal. Something is wrong with this group of people. They just aren't striving hard enough, or they're taking a long but deliberate voyage to having what we have. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the post-colonial subjectivity that becomes a part of the imagination of the church, is we could unwittingly imply that same language. We have mature Catholics and we have unsophisticated raw Catholics around the globe. We have mature, sophisticated societies and we have developing societies, and the language already kind of embraces that hierarchy. And the question is, what can we go do for these people? But not how can these people, in John's words, put us back in touch with our kind of original theological visions? They may be closer to that vision. So there's no reciprocity in it. The colonizing gaze is one that is unreciprocated, and it does not demand or seek reciprocation. Reciprocity is the foundation of love. You can't teach the people you don't love. You can't be in solidarity with people you don't love, and kind of we need a kind of a human plane of existence as a prerequisite. So the post-colonial can, I think, be a space. It's not unfraught with some of the same Marxist tensions that others have mentioned, but the post-colonial space can be one of intersubjectivity. It can be one of mutuality. It can be one of reciprocity. But we have to stop thinking about a first world and a second world and a third world or a developed nation, or, we have to get beyond that. The demographics are already here. This isn't the future, it's now. We understand what the church is going to look like phenotypically in 2100. And we can anticipate that with great joy. Or we can see it as some challenge that we have to face. I'm sorry, John's got his hand up, so I've been talking on. I want you finish, John.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to say that, and I don't know if I should say this even, but I visited the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Of course, now I'm an expert, only once, but that was the Belgian Congo, which was probably the most, brutal colonial regime in Africa. I'm not sure, but with that church now, in some ways, it's not an abstract question, the colonial mentality and the complicity of the church in it. It's a very concrete question. And if you go there, you see there's ways in which it has been concretely resolved. That church is 95% Black now. The hierarchy is all African. And that's almost a miracle, it seems to me. There's something happened there where the colonial history of the church wasn't as important to people as the gospel, and that somehow the gospel took and the church became itself there. And I can't second guess how that happened or why it happened, but my impression of the church there is that it's the only institution that's truly credible in that society. The government is not as credible as the church for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. So much of the commonweal of that country, as I saw it, and I'm an amateur, was in the hands of the church. So there's a kind of way in which you can ask the question abstractly, but you can also look in the concrete. So I'm not going to say from a theoretical point of view what the complicity of the church in colonialism, its legacy was or is. I looked. Now, I'm not an expert, I'm qualifying it, but I was so moved by what I saw when I went there. It touched me very deeply everywhere I went, and I'll never forget it. So that there's a center of gravity there now, which is Black and is evangelical, is gospel-oriented, is ecclesial in a completely rejuvenated or renewed way. I went to a mass that was sung according to the rite of Zaire, and it touched me so deeply. It was so, moving and so Catholic and so African at the same time, and so Black at the same time. I've never felt anything like that. Not that what I feel has anything to do with the validity of the liturgy and the Eucharist. I'm not saying that, but I was very moved. I'm just reporting this, that's all.
Thank you both, John and Ernest. We have a few more minutes remaining, and there are actually two questions. There are three, but I'll collapse the two questions because I think they're both related. Christy asks about Catholic media institutions and the role that they play in forming consciences. And so she says, how can Catholic media institutions better embody and teach the Catholic social teaching principles we have discussed this afternoon, and whether there are any examples to be imitated? Related to this, Alexander does ask, can either of the speakers point to helpful resources that apply Catholic social teaching to the issues of race and racism? And so I'll put those two questions briefly and conclude with one final question after your responses.
That's probably more of an Ernest question.
Ernest.
So I have a more rebellious response, I think, to the first question. I think we know the resources that are out there, but this was also the Soren conversation. I just think that the way that John was taken by his trip to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I'm taken by kind of the youth ecclesial movements here in the United States and throughout the world that I don't yet think have the media representation. And we have the tools at our disposal for DIY media production that I would say, let's not kind of change to conform to what is already, I think, a vibrant and important ministry, but the canvas is blank and the tools are available. And I think we need to construct these media. It was like a response to Elizabeth's question before, where I was going to say, I think of wokeness as a discourse, not something that coheres inside of an individual. What we need is a Catholic counter discourse. We have, as you alluded to, but not the spaces yet. So I think this is a project. I think we're at the beginning of it. But what we'd want, sung beautifully, I think really resonated with me from John's language. I want it to be funky and loud and boisterous and wholly centered in Christ. But I think that is more what St. John Paul II was thinking about in evangelizing the culture, that it could be informal networks, it could be social media, but I think that that work really remains to be done.
Thank you for that, Ernest. And on the final questions from Kevin, who asks, how do either of you suggest collaborating with or not collaborating with Black Lives Matter groups while still advocating for our Catholic understanding of these issues? And I think that's a good question to wrap up this panel's discussion of loving our neighbor and who is our neighbor. So, John, any thoughts?
Yeah, in deference, I'm going to give Ernest the last word here. But I guess for me anyway, I'm going to only speak for myself. I don't really have a theoretical answer, and I'm not a very practical person. But to take the question seriously is already in part a collaboration, it seems to me, because so many people have said you can't take the question seriously because you can't take the ideology that undergirds the movement. I want to point out there, and I think this maybe relates to the media question too, that a lot of the appeal of something like Black Lives Matter or these other kinds of maybe more secular movements is that in some ways they represent, a Christian dynamic shorn of its theological and supernatural element. So there's a kind of secular drawdown or reduction of the idea of repentance, but it doesn't go anywhere because there's no supernatural or there's no account of grace. There's a kind of eschatology in Marxism, for instance, but the eschatology is wholly within this world and has nothing to do with transformation of the cosmos or anything like that. So in some ways, these dynamics, because they're drawn from Revelation but reduced, they still have a way of appealing, and our job, in a sense, is to put them back into the larger framework in a way that they were drawn down from, and to appeal to the imagination, to in a way, take the appeal that's already there and expand it into the domain of evangelization and of grace and of true eschatology and true conversion. And I think that really grabs the imagination, but that's also a way of exploiting a certain kind of common starting point, maybe. I don't know. That's a theoretical answer. It's not very practical.
Thank you, John. And Ernest.
Yeah, I'm 100% with John. I was thinking, just to piggyback on John's for my own response, I think that our challenge around Black Lives Matter is further exacerbated by the repudiation of Black Lives Matter movement by the mainstream media and how they're codified. I think there's probably even more proximity to what John is saying in the actual movement than what we see on TV in 30-second news clips. But I think my response is really kind of a further kind of elucidating of the Elizabeth question and the Deirdre question, and I think the Kevin question, and that is, I don't so much see the movement as much as what the movement brings out in people's yearning. And we need to speak to the person that is drawn to the movement, but maybe even more powerfully drawn to what John is articulating. And so rather than worry about like how we engage or don't engage, I think for me the question is, what is it in people that demands an answer to their sufferings? And how can we do that? Otherwise, it's a logical pathway to pursue. If the Black Lives Matter is saying, we hear your suffering, and we see the church is silent on it, that's what I'm going to choose. But if there's a choice, or at least a dialogue, I don't want to put up this movement as kind of the Antichrist, because I think that there's a lot to it that we have benefited from, although I don't agree with everything that's happening. But I do believe a kind of an ecumenical, so to speak, dialogue about the sin of racism that involves a Catholic perspective is how we do that. There will be moments where we need to collectively leverage, and I think that we should do that. But I do think there should be a distinctly Catholic voice in this conversation. And I think that needs to happen. And so there's the engagement, but I really think about the dialogue. How can we listen to people? How can we actually learn from the unrest, what we may have not gotten right, at the same time that we offer a vision that is 2,000 years old that we believe very passionately in, that is the higher course, and that is love. And we have to love those who are even stained with the sin of racism as much as we love our own selves, because they too are part of our body. So I think we can do that in a way that's not soft, in a way that's not backpedaling, in a way that's not unwoke. And I love the Sword and Question Fellows, because I know that's how we're caricatured when we come in and talk about the love of Christ. There's no place for the love of Christ. We're at war right now. And I think that we can engage in a humane dialogue where we hear that rage and we don't dismiss it outright, but we offer something that we think is superior in love and in solidarity with these folks. I think that that is possible.
Thank you both so much for this profound example of how this dialogue could indeed take place. I particularly would like to, I'd like to salute both John and Ernest for truly educating and enlightening so much. And I think giving a real credible voice to what the approach could be towards our Catholic understanding of anti-racism beyond what's being offered today. I'd like to thank the participants for attending this panel. There is an upcoming panel titled What We Owe in Healthcare at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, where you will log in using the same Zoom webinar for all sessions. More information and a complete schedule can be found at the Nicola Center's website, ethicscenter.nd.edu. Once again, my thanks to our panelists and my thanks to those who are attending. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.